Alrighty, good morning everyone. Thank you for joining our Gardening Basics talk this morning. Our speaker today, Susan Fritz, has been an Alameda County Master Gardener since 2014. She began her gardening adventures as a child, learning through her parents on caring for ornamental plants while growing up on one of the University of California ag field stations where her dad served as superintendent. Her love of plants extended to vegetables when she purchased her first home in Fremont. She grows a variety of berries, fruit trees, vegetables, and herbs in 5 raised beds in her backyard. She is also a lover of roses and has over 20 varieties in her garden. She is currently the Assistant Project Lead for the Speakers Bureau of the Master Gardeners of Alameda County.
Thank you, Connie. I appreciate that. Well, good morning, everyone. We're very happy that you're here to join us to learn about the basics of gardening. And I'd like to let you know that you should be muted. If you're not, please mute yourself. We are also recording this, and so we're asking that you make sure that you turn off your video. We do have a person that will be monitoring the chat box for your questions. Her name is Deb Fries, spelled F-R-I-E-S. And so if you could please be sure to try to get your questions into us before the half-hour mark, we would greatly appreciate it, because she's trying to group the questions and to synthesize them to provide me with questions at the end of the talk. So now that we have that out of the way, I would like to have the first polling question put up to see what area of Alameda County or other area you are from. Connie, if you could provide that polling question. I'll give you a few minutes to fill that out. Okay, it looks like we have a preponderance of people coming from North Alameda County, and with 47% coming from Berkeley and the Oakland area. We have another 32% coming from South Alameda County, like Hayward and Fremont, and then people from elsewhere in California. So that's wonderful. I'm going to then move on to my first slide and talk about our mission statement. Most people don't know that Master Gardeners are all volunteers, and we are part of the University of California Cooperative Extension. And our mission is to take the research-based knowledge that comes from the University of California and other sources and pass that on to the residents of Alameda County and California. And so the information that we share is on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscape practices. And we are guided by our core values and strategic initiatives. So I always ask the question of people, why do you want to grow your own food? And my answer to this question is, I just love going out into my garden before lunch or dinner and picking some strawberries, getting some squash or green beans or tomatoes, and bringing them inside and preparing them for that very meal. So the food is as fresh as it can possibly be. I love being outside, especially during this time of COVID-19. I think it's wonderful to spend time outdoors. It's a good source of exercise, and it really lifts my spirits. I also know exactly what is used on the food that I'm growing. And if I want it to be organic or not, that's my choice. So the first thing that we're going to take a look at is the site and soil that you need to consider when setting up a garden. Now, this picture that you're looking at is my zucchini plant this year. And I have gone out, throughout the day, and this photo was actually taken at 4:30 in the afternoon. And so I know this plant gets at least about 10.5 to 11.5 hours of sunlight per day. And you can see it is a very happy, healthy plant. And so what I'd like to point out to you is that vegetable plants need at least 8 hours of light per day. And you can determine what spot in your yard may provide this amount of light by going out, early in the morning when the sun first comes up, and then maybe every 3 or 4 hours after that throughout the day to see where you have the most light. And that's an easy way to figure out the best spot to put your garden. Now, I also know that for this particular bed, that in the winter time, that my house actually shades this bed. And so that changes how I determine what I'm going to plant there for the cool season. So those are all considerations that you need to make when picking a spot for sun and shade. You need a water source nearby, and this can just be a single hose bib. And you can use a variety of methods for watering. You can use your garden hose, a sprinkler, a soaker hose, or drip irrigation. And we'll spend more time talking about that later on in this presentation. The next thing that you want to consider is the garden close to your home? Now, some people don't have a large backyard like I do. Some people rent a raised bed in a community garden, but make sure it's on your way to and from work, or that it's very close to where you live, so that you know that you'll spend time there, because this does take time to care for your plants. You need to consider whether you're going to grow in raised beds, in containers, or in the ground. You also need to decide to choose level ground. This is really important because if you're growing on a slope, you'll always have to be worried about where the water ends up. It will pool. You may even have soil that drains away from your plants. And so you really want to make sure that you're gardening on level ground. I think at this point, I'd like to have the first question. What is your level of gardening experience? So Connie, if you could put up that particular poll question. Okay, I've ended the polling and I'm going to see if I can share those results with you. But 39% of you have 5 or more years of experience, with it looks like about 47% of you having less than 2 years of experience. So that's wonderful. You're going to get a good start by hearing this presentation. So I hope that you learn a lot as we go along. The next item we're going to talk about is the soil. Everything in the garden starts with the soil. If you don't have good quality soil, you will be struggling to grow your vegetables. And so I'd like to direct your attention to the graphic that's on the side. If you notice, soil is made up of water and air. Air is required for roots to grow well. Most people don't think about that, but that is the case. They need to have organic matter, which we also call humus. And then the mineral components of the soil are very important. This is basically very finely ground up rocks, and this is where plants get a lot of their minerals from. But the thing I'd really like to point out is that 50% of soil is the pore space, the space that water and air take up. Most people don't think about that when they're looking at their soil. Now, most of you kind of probably have an idea what type of soil you may have. You may have a clay soil that looks very fine and it stays wet a long time. That's pretty typical soil here in Alameda County. Or you may have very sandy soil, especially if you're closer to the bay. Sandy soil has a really hard time holding water. You may waste a lot of water because it's so hard to keep the water near the root zone of plants. But there is one thing that can improve both of these types of soil, and that is compost. We highly recommend that you add compost every single year to your soil to improve its quality. You want to focus on the top 6 inches of the soil. This is where your topsoil is. And your ultimate goal is to achieve soil that really is easy to work and is able to hold water for your plants. I've been gardening in my garden now for 20 years, and I have added compost to my raised beds every single year. And I have to say that the soil that I have is very easy to work. I can put a shovel in it, it slides right in, and I can turn the soil over very easily. And it's just wonderful to work with, and my plants really love it. Now, if you're going to be growing container-grown vegetables, we highly recommend that you purchase a planting mix. You can make these yourself. However, if you're a brand new gardener, we definitely recommend that you purchase something pre-made. So let's move on to the next slide. I have a few issues sometimes with the slides not wanting to advance. And so I think that we're ready for the next polling question. And Connie, that question is, what are the important considerations when choosing where to place a garden? Okay. All right, I'm going to end that polling. It looks like 92% of you agreed that yes, all of those issues are important. So you should consider all of those things when you are planning to place a garden. So let's move on to fertilizer. Lots of questions about fertilizer and how those work. So I have a graphic here that shows 3 numbers. And if you look where those arrows come from, you'll see that those numbers represent nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium. For short, we call those the NPK. And the reason that this is on the packages is, number 1, it's required by law. And number 2, it tells you what you're getting in that bag. And so when I purchase a 100-pound bag of fertilizer with these numbers on it, there are 10 pounds of nitrogen, 5 pounds of phosphate, and 5 pounds of potassium in that bag. And the rest of the bag is filler. Now, when I'm purchasing a fertilizer, I want to fulfill the needs of the soil. And in California soils, the primary nutrient that is lacking is nitrogen. And so you want to definitely look for a fertilizer that has a higher N number of the NPK than the rest. The phosphate and potassium are not quite as important. You want to apply this initially at planting time. You want to add it only if it's required. And how do you know if it's required? You can have your soil tested. I know some people use at-home kits. I haven't had a lot of success with that, but that doesn't mean that you can't. Or you can send a sample of your soil to a commercial laboratory to have it analyzed. And that will tell you a lot about your soil to start. Remember that more fertilizer is not better. You definitely want to follow the package direction as to how much to add. Usually it will say, apply X pounds per so many square feet. Or if you're planting a transplant, it'll say add 1 tablespoon per 4-inch plant. And so you'll have the option of how much to add based on what the directions on the package say. And you do have the choice of using organic versus conventional fertilizers. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that next. So we have our chemical fertilizers. They are generally low cost. They act quickly. I don't know if you've ever applied this type of a fertilizer to a lawn, but it will green up very quickly after you've added a chemical fertilizer. However, some people do not like using these because they are they use non-renewable fossil fuels to be produced. Methane is burned in the presence of air, and that's how they're made. So that's something to consider. However, you have to realize that billions of people have been saved from starvation because of these types of fertilizers, so that they have had worldwide importance in helping people to have food to eat. Now, the next option is organic fertilizers. They're generally renewable and biodegradable, but they're not all necessarily sustainable. Bat guano is one of the examples of those that are not currently sustainable. As bats are in decline, so is the amount of guano available. And so that would be something you'd want to pay attention to. The nutrient content is often lower. Some do contribute organic matter to the soil. They are slower release, and generally they are higher cost. So those are some of the things that you would want to consider when choosing a fertilizer. And I think at this point, we'd like to have another polling question, Connie, and that would be the third question. What are the components of soil that allow plants to grow well? Excellent. 91% of you selected the 4 components of soil: air, water, minerals, and organic matter. And that is correct. Those are the 4 things that are very important to have in the soil. And remember that the organic matter is also called humus, and you can add to that by adding compost to your soil. So I'm going to close that out and we'll move on. So I'm going to do a little summary to this point. I've taken a shovel and I've turned my soil over. And what does it mean to turn the soil over? Well, if I was growing in the ground, generally a shovel is about 6 inches deep. And remember that top 6 to 12 inches is the most important. So I'll dig down with my shovel and I'll move the soil over to the soil next to it that I have not turned over yet. Kind of break up that soil so that it's not doesn't have large clumps in it. I will continue down the same road doing the same thing, digging out soil, putting it onto soil I haven't worked yet, all the way down until I'm done, and then I'll move it back. And again, this action helps to break up the soil. I'll do that as many rows as required to cover the area I plan to garden. Then I will spread compost on top of that. And generally, when I am adding compost to my garden, I'll add about a 1.5 cubic foot bag of compost About a 4-foot by 8-foot area. So that can kind of give you a general idea where to start from. So I've turned the soil once, I've added compost, and now I'm going to mix the compost in. And I'm basically going to take my shovel and I'm going to turn the soil over again to get that to mix in. And the next thing I'm going to do then is level the soil. I'm going to take a metal rake, not a leaf rake, a metal rake, and I'm going to level out the soil. Now the next thing that I need to do is make a decision. Generally, if I'm planting seeds, I will broadcast my fertilizer. Based on the package directions, I will measure out how much fertilizer to cover the space that I am going to garden in. And so what I'll do is I have measuring cups. I also have a scale that I use to measure out how much fertilizer I need. And I will sprinkle it over the whole area that I'm going to garden. And then I'll plant my seeds and set up my watering. Now the other option, if I purchase transplants, is to not add the fertilizer over the whole area, but to add fertilizer in the planting hole where I'm going to put the transplant. So that's the decision I have to make at this point, is when to add the fertilizer. So let me go back through that one last time. I turn the soil, I add my compost, I turn the soil again, I rake it with a metal rake to level it off, and then I make the decision about when to add my fertilizer, depending on what it is I'll be planting. Okay, I think that we are ready for the next polling question, Connie. And that is, California soils are primarily lacking in which nutrient? Okay, most of you have voted, and it looks like 91% of you understood that nitrogen is primarily lacking in California soils. And so that is the case. You really want to pay attention to how much nitrogen you're adding to the soil in order to grow a vegetable garden. So let's move on. Let's talk about seeds and transplants. So the first thing we have to consider when planting a vegetable garden is whether we're going to be planting cool season or warm season crops. And some examples of those would be a warm season vegetable would be, what you typically think of during the summertime. Tomatoes and squash and green beans and peppers, cucumbers and corn. And so you think about these, but these plants really only like to grow in warm weather. They like to have sustained warm temperatures. Now, cool season vegetables include things like cabbage and broccoli, carrots, beets, lettuces, and spinach. And these particular vegetables like temperatures between about 55 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you're planning on planting a vegetable garden, you have to think about what season is approaching. So right now we're in the warm season, and what's approaching is the cool season. And so at this point in time, you would actually want to be planning a cool season garden, not a warm season garden. If you just decided to plant corn today, you would likely not have enough time during the warm weather. The warm weather would run out before the corn could actually put up an ear of corn. So you really need to know what season is approaching that I need to plan for. And one of the things that I always remind people is, don't go pick a bunch of vegetables that you really don't like. Pick something that you know that you'll eat, right? You want to have success and you want to enjoy what you're growing. So always consider, is it the cool season that's coming or the warm season? And the biggest difference between those two is the temperature, the air temperature for those plants to thrive. Now there are some plants that I think are easy to grow from seed. If we're going to be going into the warm season, I like to grow green beans and squash. I think those are really easy to grow from seed. My zucchini plant, which you saw at the beginning of the presentation, was grown entirely from seed. For the cool season, which is approaching, and this is what you should be planning for, I think beets and radishes are easy to grow from seed, and carrots have to be started from seeds. The seeds are extremely fine, which makes them a little bit more difficult to work with. But carrots don't like to have their root disturbed, and so you shouldn't grow those as a transplant. So these are a few options that you can select where you'll probably have success right away. So if I'm going to purchase seeds, there's a lot of information on the seed packet that's very important to read. It will tell you how deep to plant the seed. And a rule of thumb is that you should plant the seed anywhere from 2 to 4 times the diameter of the seed. Now for seed spacing, it will tell you how far up to plant the seeds. So what I like to do when I'm doing this is I take a ruler or a tape measure and I lay it directly on the soil, and I place my seeds exactly at those spacings. Some people like to eyeball this. I don't think that's a terrible thing to do, but I like to use a ruler. So sometimes they'll even tell you as well that you need to plant more than 1 seed at each spot. The next thing that you need to do, that you'll see on the back of the package, is thin your plants that come up. A lot of people don't like doing this because they think, well, I'm killing this plant. Well, yes, you are. But in order for the one that you leave behind to survive well and to do well, you need to thin at those spacings, because the adult plant may be much larger and need to take up more space as well. Now the rule for thinning is that you thin at the point after a couple of sets of true leaves have appeared. I have a photograph on this picture, on this page, that shows that there are some oval, smooth-edged leaves near the soil. Those are called the seed leaves. Those are the embryonic leaves that come from the seed. They're also called the cotyledon. And then if you notice the set of leaves above those, they have these sawtooth edges. Those are the true leaves. Those leaves, you'll continue, as the plant continues to grow, you'll see more and more of those types of leaves. Those are the leaves that define this particular plant. I believe this is a cucumber plant. So you'll want to make sure that you have a couple sets of true leaves before you thin to the proper spacing. So that means that if I planted seeds every 4 inches and the package then tells me to thin to every 8 inches, that means I'm going to remove a plant in between each one so that I get the final 8-inch spacing. When to sow outside. So the package will tell you to sow outside so many days after the last frost date, or when outside temperatures reach a certain level, or so many days before the first frost date. And generally the first frost date in the Bay Area is around December 15th. And the last frost date can vary between about January 15th in the very mild areas of the Bay Area, all the way out to into early February for some of the areas that get colder. So you would need to look those dates up for your particular area to know when to sow outside. When to start inside. Now this is for if you're going to grow your own transplants. Now if you're a brand new gardener, I don't recommend that you try doing your own transplants to start, because there's a lot that you need to learn, equipment you need to purchase in order to do this. I would recommend that you go to a garden center and purchase your own transplants from them. Now I had an alarm go off just a few seconds ago, and that was to remind me to ask you to put your questions into the chat box over the next 5 minutes, and then to please stop asking questions, because the person who's monitoring the chat box needs time to synthesize your questions into reasonable things to ask me at the end. So I think at this point, Connie, we would also like to have the next polling question, and that is, what is the primary difference between warm season and cool season vegetables? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share those results with you. So almost 80% of you have the correct answer, and that is that warm season vegetables require long, hot days and warm soil temperatures to mature. And cool season vegetables grow best when temperatures are 55 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Now this question was a little bit trickier because one of the answers is generally true as well, but it's not the primary reason, the primary difference between warm season and cool season vegetables. And that is the first statement. Warm season vegetables are grown for their fruit. So think about tomatoes and green beans and zucchini. When you allow a plant to grow, flower, be pollinated, and then produce fruit, like with those 3 plants I just mentioned, that's generally going to be a warm season vegetable. For cool season vegetables, you grow the plant, think about a lettuce or cabbage head or broccoli, and you harvest the plant itself. It would be almost like you know, in comparison to one that you grow for fruit, like a tomato plant, you would be eating the limbs of the tomato plant. So you're actually eating the plant itself when you grow cool season vegetables. But the primary difference between the two is that they require different temperatures in order to thrive. Okay, let's move on. So you've decided what you want to grow as seeds, but let's talk about selecting transplants. So you go to the garden center and you're thinking, oh boy, it's going to be the warm season and I'm gonna buy zucchini plants. Okay. And you see that the 6-pack is a lot less expensive than buying a 4-inch pot. So you think, okay, I'm gonna buy myself 6 zucchini plants. Well, you saw how large my zucchini plant was. If you buy 6 of those, you'll be able to open a farm stand to sell zucchini if you do that. Or you need to find 5 good friends who want to also grow zucchini, and you can share those with them. But for that type of plant, I would buy 1 single 4-inch plant. So I recommend before you go to the garden center that you decide how many plants and what you want to buy, what types of plants you want to have. And when you go there, you want to look for plants that are green. If they're yellow, maybe don't pick that plant. If they look spindly, you know, they don't have very many leaves, don't pick that plant. So you really want to see a bounty of leaves that are green, and you want to take a look. So I'm going to hold up this example, and I'm going to look underneath here to see if I see roots growing out of the bottom of the pot. If that happens, that means that that plant has likely been in that container a long time, and roots may have circled inside and compacted, and it may have a difficult time getting a good start in the ground if that has happened. Now, why would I buy transplants? Sometimes, you know, life happens and I don't get time to get my seeds in the ground, or I don't start my transplants soon enough under my grow lights. And so I just say, well, I need to go to the garden center. They've done all that work for me. It's going to save me some time. And it may give me a head start over starting everything from seed by that point. So those are some considerations that you want to make when selecting a plant. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the 6-pack. Generally, you can purchase vegetable plants per plant for less money in a 6-pack. Now, of course, these plants are younger than a 4-inch, but they do catch up fairly quickly to a 4-inch pot. So let's say that I want to grow lettuce in my cool season garden. A 6-pack would be reasonable if I had a family of 4. Now, I only have me and my husband, so I might just start these from seed for myself. But if you had a family and you wanted 6 heads of lettuce, this would be the way to go. It's relatively inexpensive. So let's continue. I like to plan my garden as well. So I use what's called an engineering notebook. This is actually from my own garden planning book. My engineering notebook has this graph paper on one side and then lined paper on the other. So the left side has graph paper, the right side has this lined paper. And so I draw out on my graph what my raised bed looks like. And then down below, I put a similar graph. You don't have to do it this way. And in the upper graph, I have recorded which plants I want to put in each square. So if you look down below, I was going to grow Napa cabbage, broccoli romanesco, and cabbage Copenhagen Market was number 3. Broccoli romanesco was 2, and Napa cabbage is 1. And I put those numbers into my little chart up there to show where I wanted to plant those. And then in the graph below, I recorded the date that I planted. There are many, many ways to do this. You do not have to use my method. There are lots of online tools to select from. Here's another example. This came straight out of the California Master Gardener Handbook. This is another schematic way of showing what you've planted. Draw the little plants and what type it was and what date you planted it. So you have many options with how you plan your garden. Now, I think, oh, nope, I'm not ready for a polling question yet. We're going to talk a little bit about planting then. If you're planting seeds, so we've already talked about that you have your soil turned over, you've added compost, you turned it again, you've leveled the soil, you broadcast some fertilizer, and you're ready to plant your seeds. Follow the package directions for spacing and depth, and water lightly. Some seeds are quite small, and if you water heavily, you'll move the seeds out of place. When I say water lightly, I like to use the misting setting on my garden hose in order to do this. I'll sometimes go out once or twice a day to make sure that the soil has remained moist so that I can guarantee that those seeds will germinate. Thin per the package directions once you have 2 to 3 sets of true leaves. Next item would be planting a transplant. So I have not added fertilizer to the soil. What I'm going to do is I'm going to dig a hole that's about the depth and width of the plant. I'm going to add my fertilizer. Usually it'll say for a 4-inch plant, add 2 teaspoons of fertilizer. So I do that. I have measuring tools that I use for that. I'll kind of mix it in a little bit into the bottom of the hole. And then I will remove the transplant from its container, but I will not lift it by its stem. Because what happens if you break the stem, you kill the plant. Generally, if you break it up high where you still have some leaves, you're okay. If you break it down near the soil though, no plant. So what I like to do is I like to take my fingers, I put my 2 fingers on either side of the stem, turn the pot over, and lift the pot away from the roots. And then I'll gently break up the roots with my fingers, turn it over, and put it in the planting hole. Then I'll fill dirt around the plant, just about a 1/4 inch above the soil level of the transplant. If you're growing tomatoes, they're planted much deeper, but I won't cover that in any detail today. And then you want to water it sufficiently to completely soak the soil. You want to avoid spraying the plant itself. Remember that if you spray soil up onto the plant, the soil has organisms in it, which may cause disease in the plant. Also, by spraying the plant, you may have problems then with powdery mildew. So you're actually promoting disease in the plant by spraying the leaves. Be very careful with that. Now, I gave this talk last week, and I did not go over how to remove a plant from a 6-pack. Now, if you notice, the 6-pack container is a little bit harder to put your hand over to do that. So kind of what I like to do is take the container and lay it on its side, on a table or on the ground, and literally squeeze the bottom. So I'm pushing up on the bottom and kind of squeezing it to force the plant out without managing the stem at all. And then I can pull it out from the front. Hopefully you were able to see that pretty well. So my next slide is going to be with regard to watering and mulch. Watering, of course, is very important for vegetables. They require a lot of water. Now, when we're looking at a watering system, the ideal things we should look for is that the amount of water be measurable. And there's a rule of thumb, about 20 gallons per week for a 4-foot by 8-foot plot. Now, if you live out in the Livermore area, you may find that this isn't enough water. But if you live in Albany, where it's very foggy, you may only need half this amount of water. So this is a starting place. You start here and then reduce or increase depending on how long the soil stays moist. If your soil is still moist 5 days after you've watered, you probably can reduce the amount that you're going to apply. You want the water only to be applied to the root zone. And so, again, we don't want to apply water to the leaves. We want to apply it between the hours of 2 a.m. and 10 a.m. Because water is very expensive in Alameda County, we want to reduce the amount of evaporation that can occur. And that is done by watering during the cool hours of the morning. You want it to be deep and infrequent. You should water 1 to 3 times per week. My zucchini plant gets watered twice a week, but I have 3 2-gallon emitters on it. And they're run for about 45 minutes twice a week. So that plant alone is getting about 10 gallons of water per week. It's a very large plant though. So earlier in my talk, I discussed that there were 4 different methods of applying water, and I'm going to talk about them right here. Now, I'm going to start at the bottom of this graph and talk about hand watering. I don't know anything that's more relaxing than hand watering. I really love doing that, but it is certainly not the ideal way to water plants. Can it be measured? Well, sort of. If you have a setting that you like to use on your spigot, you could, spray the water into a bucket to see how many gallons you're applying over X amount of time, and then you could time yourself while you're watering. You could do that. It can go just to the root zone. You have to do that yourself. You could have some issues with water splashing. Can it be put on a timer? Well, if you want to get up at 2 a.m. to go water your plants, I guess you could be on a timer, but most people don't want to do that. The cost is quite low, however. The next item is the sprinkler. Can it be measured? Not really. Would it be applied only to the root zone? No. In fact, it might land on your on your sidewalk, your ornamental plants, all the things you don't really need to water or want to water at that time. And it's overhead, so you get a lot of water on the leaves of the plants. Can you put it on a timer? Yes, you can. Is the cost low? Yes. Maybe for $15, you could get a sprinkler. The next item is a soaker hose, and I like to call this the poor person's drip watering. Can it be measured? No, not really. Would it be applied to the root zone? Yes. Can it be put on a timer? Yes. And the cost is quite low. Some people, this is all they ever garden with is soaker hoses. They never go to drip watering. And we'll see why that might be. With drip watering, if you notice, I mentioned for my zucchini plant that I have 3 2-gallon drippers on it. So yes, for drip, everything can be measured. It's all applied just to the root zone. It's on a timer, but the cost can be quite high. When my husband and I moved into our home 20 years ago, nothing was on drip watering. Everything had to be watered by hand. So we've spent literally thousands of dollars putting in drip watering throughout our entire yard, both for my vegetable beds and for my ornamental plants. And so drip watering is really the gold standard for watering, but it is expensive. So let's continue moving on. I'm almost done. I'm on the last section, and that is regarding mulch. Mulch helps to conserve water in the soil, and as you know, for Alameda County, that's very important. It prevents weed growth by blocking light to the soil. No matter how many times you have weeded your soil, you will still have weed seeds in it. And if you can block light from landing on the soil, you'll prevent the germination of weed seeds. Mulch also can add organic material to the soil, and you can use many different materials as mulch. I like to use straw on my vegetable beds. Do not purchase hay. Hay has seeds in it, and you will create a weed problem for yourself if you use hay. So purchase straw. You can use bark. I like to use bark on my ornamental beds. Wood chips or shredded leaves. This is not an all-inclusive list. There are many things you can use as mulch. You want to use a 2 to 4 inch layer of mulch. If you use bigger pieces, if you use very large bark, you actually need a greater depth because that doesn't compact very well. So if you use smaller size mulch, you don't need as deep a layer. You want to leave a space around the base of a plant, maybe about 1 inch away, to prevent root rot. Because if you don't allow the soil to dry out a little bit around the base of the plant, you could end up with that type of a problem. So I have a few resources here for you about watering in drought conditions. And we're pretty much always under water restrictions here in Alameda County. And so there are some things that you can do. to help with watering your food plants. So I'll leave that up for a little bit. And Connie, I think I will do my last question, or my last polling question here. The method of watering you choose should deliver the following benefits. Okay, it looks like most of you have answered the question, and 92% of you selected the correct answer. You wanted to give these 4 benefits: be applied at a specific time of the day in a specific amount and applied only to the root zone. Those are very important. Okay, I'm going to move on to some other resources that you may be interested in. We have trials gardens, most of which are not available right now. We do speaking engagements, which you can request through our website. We have a help desk if you have questions regarding gardening issues. And we have a website that you can go to. Okay, Deb, I think I'm going to be ready here pretty quickly for you to start providing me with questions that people have given to you through the chat box.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Deb.
Okay, great. So there was a lot of questions, and I did my best to collate them all together and group them. So
Okay.
one of them I'll start with is kind of about specific vegetable plants. So this is from Janice. She says, I think I have tomato wilt on my plants. She was given the plants. What to do at this stage? I have removed the infected leaves immediately, daily. Also, I keep the ground clear of weeds and leaves.
Well, I know that I don't know if she's absolutely certain that it's a disease or if it's the warm days that are causing the plant to look wilted. I'm really not sure how to answer that question, and I'm going to ask that she maybe provide her email address and we can respond to her after the fact.
Okay, the next one is about growing tomatoes. This is from Lena. Growing tomatoes in garden beds, how high does the soil need to be?
Okay. Growing, well, that could mean quite a few different things. When you're planting a tomato, you actually want to remove as many leaves from the stem as you can and still leave the top sets of true leaves on the plant. And then you bury the entire, as much of the stem as you can below the level of the soil. And so the plant could be planted 10 inches deep if that were to happen. So that would kind of determine how deep your bed would need to be. My raised beds are about 36 inches tall. That's mostly because I don't like kneeling that much anymore. But my tomato plants seem to do quite well in that. I hope that answered the question.
Okay, the next one is from Virginia. My zucchini watermelon start to grow, then they fall off the vine. Why?
Well, that could have to do with pollination issues. I'm not exactly sure if you're seeing like the young zucchini start to form, but then they just die off that way, I would guess that might be a pollination issue. So you want to make sure that you have other plants around that attract bees. So that could mean ornamental plants. It could be other vegetable plants that have lots of flowers on them. And for a zucchini plant, you may see the flowers, but you have to have both the male flower and the female flower flowering at the same time. And so when a zucchini plant first starts growing, the first flowers are generally only male flowers. So it may take a few weeks for the female flowers to start opening as well. And the bees will transfer the pollen from the male flower to the female flower that's on the same plant. Now you can actually help this process along by using a Q-tip or a small brush to move the pollen from the male flower to the female flower. How do you tell what the male flower and female flower look like? Well, the female flower at the outside base of the flower will have kind of what looks like a start of a little zucchini. And so you'll know that the flower that doesn't have that is the male flower, and you want to transfer the pollen from one to the other.
Okay, and then the last one on specific veggies is from Joey T. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Which vegetable plant lasts more than one season?
Okay, so when we have plants, we divide them generally into categories that are called annuals and perennials. Most vegetable plants are annuals. They grow for one season. They supply seeds for the following year. And so they're really, I'm trying to think of any perennial vegetables would be something like an artichoke, an asparagus. These have root structures that allow them to persist into the following year. And so there are a few perennial vegetables that we consider vegetables anyway.
Okay, and then Janice asked, are slides available?
Currently, no. We have our own logos and advertising in our presentations. And so at this point, we do not supply the slide deck to participants.
But this will be recorded and put on a YouTube channel, right? So,
yes, it will be.
Yes. Okay, so we have, what, 2 more minutes before it's 10. We have a lot more questions than what we can go through. So let me kind of pick some ones. Okay, so another one from Joy T. Compost versus mulch versus garden soil versus potting soil. What to use when?
Okay.
Compost versus mulch versus garden soil versus potting soil.
Okay. If I'm planting in containers, I only use a potting soil. It's generally a sterilized mix, and so you don't have to worry so much about the diseases that build up in natural soil over time. But I would change my potting soil every year in containers. Now, my raised beds are a mixture of the native soil from my garden and compost. And I found that to be an excellent combination. Mulch is used to lay on top of the soil in order to retain moisture, primarily, and to help prevent the growth of weeds. And so that's really the difference between what my soil is composed of and what I use as mulch. And I don't apply mulch until after I've put my drip watering in place or my soaker hoses in place. I place the mulch on top of that. And there was something I was going to say and now I can't think of it. Oh, well, it left my brain.
Okay, it is 10 o'clock. I don't know if I should stop or if...
I would say let's do 5 more minutes and then we'll do our hard stop at 10:05.
Okay, so now I'm going to go to the topic, growing in containers. So this is Joey T. Can you grow vegetables in pots and not transplant in the ground?
Yes, you can. What you would want to look for are items or seeds that are specifically for pots. They'll make, they have seeds for, smaller versions of vegetable plants. They'll have like lettuces that are relatively small in size, or even cabbages. Tomatoes grow well in pots as well. And you have to determine how much water to add to them based on the type of pot you use. If you use clay pots, they themselves soak up water, whereas if you use plastic pots, they don't. And so you need to consider that when you're growing vegetables. Might be better to do them in plastic pots than in clay.
Okay, and then another one on containers is from Nicholas. How often should I water my herbs in pots that are on the patio?
Well, I have a raised bed with perennial herbs, and it is watered twice a week, but not very heavily. Most herbs, actually, I think, don't like a lot of water. I grow currently oregano and tarragon, rosemary, thyme, and I only have half-gallon drippers on that, and so not a lot of water, but twice a week.
Okay, and now there's a fertilizer question from June. Can you use a slow release fertilizer such as Osmocote when planting transplants?
Yes, you can. When I plant ornamentals in pots, I use Osmocote, and they do make a type for vegetable plants as well, which you could definitely use. And that's a really nice type of fertilizer, because you wouldn't need to make a second application later on because generally those last for anywhere from 4 to 6 months.
Okay, seedlings now from Michelle. My seedlings sometimes get chewed off. Is it better to plant bigger plants? What else can I do?
Well, if they're getting chewed by something, it might be snails. You could put diatomaceous earth around them. You could put copper banding around them. You can also cover them. You could take a milk carton and cut the top off and the bottom off and just set it over the plant, and that would help keep some insects or other things from munching them. If it's squirrels, you might want to make little cages out of chicken wire or something like that to put over the plant until it gets large enough that they can't do so much damage. So there are a variety of things you can do to help prevent your plants from getting eaten.
Okay, let's see. We've got one more minute. I'm trying to see which one. Okay. Becoming a master gardener. How can one become a master gardener in Alameda County?
Excellent question.
From Debbie.
If you go to our website, the website has a band of, it's a picture of poppies, and directly sitting on top of that is another gray band, and it asks the question, do you want to become a master gardener? If you click on that, it will take you to a page, and you can sign up to go to a session in late 2020 on information about how to become a master gardener.
So Google Alameda County Master Gardeners, and that'll get you to our website.
Correct.
So we're at the time. So some of the questions that, or the categories that I didn't address were about propagating, and some about citrus and apple trees. So those types of questions, recommend you could go to our help desk and ask the same question. And our help desk is in that website, the Alameda County Master Gardeners, and it's down towards the bottom in a section called Advice to Grow By. Just ask us. So yeah, sorry I couldn't get to every question. They were all wonderful questions, but I think we're out of time now.
Yes. So if you're interested in learning more about us and would like to receive a newsletter from us, we do have this available to you. You can go on our website and sign up for this, and we highly recommend it. It has lots of interesting articles in it and ways that you can connect with the Master Gardeners. And I will show the final slide.